This episode is all about how to be the external tax advisor that in-house tax teams value and want to work with. Our guest for this episode, Stephen Hodgson, has been the in-house Head of Indirect Tax for what is now Entain, and he's been there for over 7 years. In this episode, he shares his advice for how to be the perfect tax advisor to in-house tax teams based on his experiences. You're listening to episode 105 of the Tax Professional podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve their careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. For those of you who are regular listeners, you'll know that this is the first episode after my first ever break from the podcast. I recorded this episode actually with Stephen just before I decided to take the break, and in some ways that was a shame because I thought that Stephen gave some highly valuable advice on the topic of being a good external advisor, and it would have been nice to release this one quickly, but on the flip side, I think it's such a good episode to have as the first episode back. I do just want to say though, thank you to the nice messages that I've had in the period since I started the break, and also thank you for coming back and continuing to listen to the podcast. I do appreciate the support and the loyalty. As I'm recording this right now, it's about 2.5 weeks into the break, and whilst that is a relatively short period of time, I'm already feeling much better and I'm already starting to feel refreshed. For the foreseeable, there will be one episode released every 2 weeks, with the next break around Christmas time, but I will announce that close to the time, and it will also be a shorter break. So on to this episode then. I reached out to Stephen to see if he'd be interested in doing this episode because, well, I was interested in what he had to say for the benefit of my own tax career. I wanted to see if there was an opportunity for me as an employment tax advisor to support in-house tax teams, and if there was, what would make me valuable and make in-house tax teams want to work with me. I knew that this information would be valuable for a lot of you too, and here we are with this episode. Without spoiling the episode too much, there is ample opportunity to support in-house tax teams as an external advisor. You just need to play your cards right, and that's what Stephen's advice in this episode is all about, and it will allow you to do exactly that. So there's a lot of useful information in this episode, but here's just a few of the highlights that are coming up. Stephen shares what he personally wants from external advisors, the good bits, and he also shares with us what he doesn't want, the bad bits. He shares what level of responsiveness and communication is needed in his personal view. He shares what he considers to be practical advice, which is the type of advice that you want to be providing. He shares some excellent advice of how to break bad news to a client in a way that the client would actually value. He gives some advice on how you can build a relationship with an in-house tax team to get the opportunity to start supporting them. And at the end of the episode, he summarises his answer to the question, how can you, as an external advisor, be the advisor that an in-house tax team wants to work with and also value? Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com/TTPP105, or by heading on over to the details section of this episode within your podcast player of choice. The show notes include all the links mentioned in this episode in one nice easy place. If you've been a listener for some time now, you may remember that Stephen actually came on the podcast previously to talk about his move from the Big Four to in-house. And that was a well-received episode actually. It was episode 52, in case you would like to go and take a listen to that one. On the point of practical tax advice, which is something that Stephen and I do discuss in this episode, this is not just something that in-house tax teams value, it's actually something that all clients value. So it's something that I suggest you learn how to do well as early in your career as is possible. And one thing to note, what you consider to be practical might not actually be practical. If you do want to make sure that you can provide excellent practical tax advice that clients will love you for, that will result in them being happy to refer you on to others, and that will leave them coming back for more, then I suggest you take a look at my tax advice masterclass. The next one is being delivered in November 2024, and the one after that will not be delivered for at least another 6 months after that. For full details of the tax advice masterclass, head on over to thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com/TTPP105. And even if you're just a little bit curious or interested, please do go and take a look. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the episode. I know this is the second time that you've been on now, Stephen, but it was back in like episode 52, I think now, so quite a long time ago. And we talked about your move from an accountancy firm to in-house back then. But for those who don't know who you are and haven't come across you before, could you tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Yeah, sure. Hard to believe it's been 2 years since I was on the podcast. I've worked in tax for more than 17 years now. And as you say, the theme of our last conversation was about how I moved, having spent more than 10 years in practice in the Big Four, mainly Deloitte, how I moved from there to being in an in-house or industry role. And I've now been in my in-house or industry role for more than 7 years. So I haven't changed jobs since we last talked, but my job has got a bit bigger. My team's got a bit bigger. The business has changed quite a bit. And that's just the business I happen to work in is one where there's always quite a bit of change taking place. And that has an impact from a tax perspective as well. I think that's me.
Yeah, because were you the first indirect tax person for Entain, or what is now Entain anyway?
It's a bit more complicated than that because of the amount of M&A that there's been in the industry that I work in. So I was the first indirect tax person into the merged Ladbrokes Coral business in late 2016. But there were predecessors to that business that had their own indirect tax people at different times. But the function we created after I joined and which we have today is very different to anything that's ever existed before. So there are now 8 of us doing indirect tax at Entain. I don't think they'd ever had probably more than 1 or 2 people in the previous organizations that went on to merge to form Entain. And so in terms of, I don't know if they ever had anyone called a head of indirect tax, but that's who I am now. And that's who I've been for the last 7 years, albeit, as I say, it started off on day one with just me doing indirect tax, and there are now 8 of us. And it started off with about 100 returns and about £500 million of tax. And now there are over 1,000 returns and £1.3 billion of indirect taxes.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. When you talk about 8 people in the context of that amount of money, it doesn't sound much. But on the flip side, when you talk about 8 people for an in-house indirect tax team, not even considering other people, that sounds like a lot, right?
Yes, I suppose that's right. I always like to put it in the context you just did, which is 8 people for £1.3 billion and over 1,000 returns isn't all that much. So I'm certainly not saying that we're overstaffed, that's for sure. But it's a good number. It does make sense in the context of the business I work in. So we have an unusual tax profile compared to a lot of large businesses. So Entain is a FTSE 100 business operating in 40, 50 different markets. It's a combination of retail and online betting and gaming. And where we're interesting from a tax profile perspective is that most of our tax cost is indirect taxes, not direct taxes. So whilst our senior management and our investors still, like in all businesses, have a really keen interest in effective tax rate and what they see on the P&L, most of the tax we're paying is in cost of sales. And it's a combination of irrecoverable VAT on our cost base. And also the main chunk of it is indirect taxes. It's gambling duties, excise duties, betting and gaming taxes all over the world. So in that sense, it makes sense that Entain would have such a big or relatively big indirect tax team.
Yeah, for sure. So given you have got quite a sizable team, maybe not in the context of the amount of money you deal with, but since you have got a sizable in-house tax team, do you still have the need to work with external advisors then on top of having your 8 people?
Yes, we work with external advisors quite a lot. I imagine the way in which we work with them and the kind of work we give them is maybe different to other organizations because we do have this large and experienced in-house team. But there are some areas where I think you have to work with an external advisor, and there are others where it would be preferable. So I'll give you some of those. So where we have to would be things like due diligence on an M&A transaction. That's not the kind of work, well, it's the kind of work where if it's a transaction of any kind of size, you're going to want someone from outside to assist with that, partly to bring a fresh pair of eyes, partly to help keep on top of the work that needs to be done in addition to the normal day job. Another area where we might tend to use advisors because it wouldn't be that well done or it would be better to have external input, would be something like preparing for a tax authority visit or tax authority audit. So we had HMRC in last year for a routine VAT visit. And one of the things I worked with advisors on ahead of that visit was to say, can we kick the tires, so to speak, on the VAT returns, the VAT processes in the business, because I wanted an independent view of that. And we wouldn't be able to do an independent view internally by definition.
Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of other areas where we'd often use advisors because we'd see it as it just makes complete sense. So one would be, we're an international business. Sometimes we're dealing with overseas issues. My team has responsibility for lots and lots of different countries, albeit we're all based in the UK. And sometimes we can handle that, and other times we can't. So there might be a particularly complex thing that comes up in another country, or some correspondence from an authority, or maybe a dispute, or who knows. And for reasons of lack of expertise in all global international tax systems and sometimes language barriers, we then go to an external advisor, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And I think in saying that, I touched on the final one I probably have on my list, which is anything to do with disputes or litigation. If that gets to a certain point, we're probably going to want to involve an external advisor, particularly if we think it's going to go down a formal litigation route.
Yeah. I suppose then the main reason as to why that is probably then, well, two main things: lack of time and lack of expertise in some jurisdictions then.
Yes, I think in those cases, that's absolutely right. We can't be experts in every system. I think we've got great coverage from a UK perspective, as you would imagine, because we are all based in the UK, albeit we do have team members who've got great experience in other jurisdictions as well, particularly EU markets. And as indirect tax professionals, that's not uncommon, especially in the world of VAT, because there's a common EU framework. And okay, the UK may have left the EU, but we know there's still significant overlap in how those systems work, and so we've got all that kind of expertise. But if you start saying to me, what are we going to do with indirect taxes in some of the more far-flung destinations, it gets more tricky. And so I think I like to credit us with being able to have a good go at any indirect tax question or problem in any jurisdiction. But as soon as you start to get a bit more technical in somewhere like South America, or even the US or Canada, or parts of Africa or Asia, then we start to become a little bit more reliant on advisors.
Yeah. So then when you are working with external advisors, what is it that you actually want from them? So not physically in terms of what their output is, but like how they act, how they are with you, how they interact with you and your team.
Yes, well, I think it was baked into your question there that technical competence goes without saying. They have to actually be able to provide the advice we want. I think alongside that, industry experience is very important for me and my team in particular. There are a lot of products and a lot of jargon that it's helpful if an advisor is familiar with or able to get up to speed with more quickly. So beyond the tax technical, talking about the industry technical, that is very, very helpful. But in terms of behavior, approach, attitude, those kind of attributes, I think we're looking for people who are available, responsive, a good bedside manner, dare I say. So an advisor that you feel comfortable with, that they can, you can talk to them about an issue, and you have the confidence that they're listening and understanding and able to respond to it, and also give practical advice, and of course someone that we enjoy working with. And I think an advisor where we feel like a valued client, and that shows itself through some of those areas I was just talking about. So things like availability and responsiveness. I suppose if those aren't there, we'll start to feel less valued, and then the relationship might get a bit more strained. And, I suppose from a relationship perspective, there are some advisors where we have a much more long-term ongoing relationship. There are probably some projects or some markets where it will be a lot more short term, but all those things still apply.
Yeah. So from your perspective, then I'm interested to know like what being responsive looks like. Are you expecting someone to respond within an hour, a day, a few days, a week? Because you know what it's like being on the other side when you've got 5 to 10 clients demanding your time all the time. It's impossible to respond to everyone, even though you would argue on the other side that you value all of them. So like, how responsive is responsive enough for you to be happy with an external advisor?
Yeah, great question. I don't have a particular time frame. That's not a great answer, is it? It's there's more of a sense of whether someone's paying attention to things. I suppose most of the time I'm engaging with advisors, I'm doing most of it by email initially and then scheduled calls rather than just picking up the phone. Maybe it would have been more common to pick up the phone randomly in the past. But, I would have thought that it's not unreasonable to expect some kind of response within 24 hours, or to expect that if someone is not going to be around because they're away, that there's very clearly someone else who's going to be picking up the work, even if that's just because there's a very clear out of office message coming back.
Yeah, because let's say then, because I think what I would really like to get from this episode is me being an external advisor. How can I make sure that an in-house team would value me? Because sometimes, like, I might not be able to give, say, the technical response or the actual answer that they're looking for in the 24 hours, but I will be able to go back to them and say, really sorry, this week I'm completely flat out. I'll be able to get back to you by X date, and it might be a week or even 2 in the future, depending on how busy I am at any moment in time. Would that be an issue from your standpoint, even because it's still like a 2-week wait potentially, or the fact that you're being told that you'll be waiting a certain amount of time, would it generally speaking be okay?
No, I think you've nailed it, which is it's all about communications and open dialogue about what the advisor is able to do and when. Obviously, if I had a really pressing, urgent issue, which can occasionally happen, and maybe I'm being pressured internally for an answer to something quite quickly, but because I'm not familiar with the issue or because of the scale of risk involved, I want to bounce it off someone externally before I respond internally. Clearly, if the answer is I'll get to you in 2 weeks' time, in that situation, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
But if it's, I do like it, and I do get this with some advisors where I will drop over an email and I won't be clear about whether it's urgent or whether it can wait a month. And good advisors will come back and say, when do you actually need this by?
Yeah.
And hopefully, because I've been there on the other side and like to think I'm a reasonable person, I will always give a realistic, honest answer. Most stuff is not required urgently. And so I like what you're saying there, Jack, which is I think if the advisor can say, well, this is what I can do, or as I say, maybe flip it the other way, when do you need this by? Is this an urgent priority? Then just that openness goes a long, long way.
Yeah.
So maybe when I say response within 24 hours, the response within 24 hours is that one, which is
is the first
when do you actually
one.
need this by? Let's be open about it.
Yeah, and because a lot of the time, like this as well, been on the other side, a lot of the time the first email doesn't contain all the information that you actually need. Like, I know, for example, you will be trying to give everything that you need, but if it's in some jurisdiction you know nothing about, inevitably you're not going to be able to give all the information first time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. And so it's maybe when I say responsiveness, a higher priority, or maybe what I really mean is just effective communication.
Yeah. And I completely get that. Because let's face it, most people, it's like when you call up HMRC, right, and you can be on the phone for like 2 hours and you don't know. But I think if you, at the start of that phone call, you were told you'll be waiting 2 hours, you'd feel better about it. I mean, still not great, but you would feel better, I think, because you know roughly how long you're going to be waiting. But I think it's the same in your situation, right? Knowing when you're going to have the answer in itself is helpful, even if you don't get the answer straight away.
Yes, I'm sure I read something that I think is relevant to this, which is, if you're waiting for a train and it says it's going to arrive in 5 minutes, or even if it says it's going to arrive in 30 minutes, that's better than just being sat, stood on the platform and it says there's a train coming.
Yeah.
Just giving people that little bit of information about whether it's 5 minutes or 30 minutes, makes them feel a lot more comfortable and confident.
Yeah. For sure. And that's probably a main reason actually why, generally speaking, prefer trains to buses, because I know some bus stops now do say the time it's going to come, but most of them don't. So you're just waiting in the dark. Yeah. So can I touch upon cost for a second then? Because, well, I'm making a assumption first off, because you're such a large business. I'm presuming in most cases you use Big Four advisors rather than, say, outside of Big Four. I mean, in the first instance, is that a fair assumption, or do you tend to work with a mixture?
It is a mixture, actually. And that is, we have some advisors that we prefer in certain jurisdictions because we've worked with them for a while and they know us, and they have tended to be Big Four, but not exclusively. It's not always Big Four. And I would say the reasons for that are sometimes in some international markets, it won't make sense to use Big Four. And that's because they might not have a good local firm. And I suppose that could equally apply to any international network of accountancy firms or tax advisors. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. And it's not always obvious, of course, especially with the Big Four or other larger firms, the way they market themselves, and the perception is, well, if they're all really strong in the UK, and as people based in the UK, we know that. And you might get a bit of a shock if you made the same assumption about those firms around the world. It's not always the case. So sometimes there will be a smaller local firm that is better placed. The other thing that I would just say in terms of whether we always use Big Four is, well, a couple of other points. So one is sometimes the technical expertise or industry expertise actually sits in another firm that isn't Big Four. And then the other time we wouldn't use Big Four would be, we will sometimes use law firms as well. And I think when I was in Big Four practice, I probably underestimated this, or maybe it's just grown since I left. But the law firms in the UK and around the world, the international networks of law firms, can be very well placed to deliver tax advice. And sometimes there might even be a slight preference for a law firm. And it might be either because something is particularly high risk and you think the law firm's going to be able to offer something different, or take a particular view where there's a real focus on the wording of the legislation rather than the broader principles. That might be helpful. Or inevitably, if it involves a dispute and litigation, you might turn to a law firm. So yeah, we go definitely beyond the Big Four.
Yeah. I suppose then, in terms of costs then, I mean, do you ever consider costs to be too high, and would that put you off an advisor, or would it really depend on like the overall service they're offering? If they're doing a good enough job, I suppose, and it's adding a lot of value to you as a firm, would the cost not necessarily matter?
It's a factor, but I think it's probably, in my particular case, in the business I work in, where you're absolutely right, it's a big business. The budgets are relatively high. There is a professional fees budget that exists every year that we can tap into. I would say sometimes we're thinking more about, is it worth involving an external advisor rather than how much are they going to charge? Because sometimes, if the work has to be done or the advice is required, then you're more interested in quality rather than getting a low price. And because of the type of work that we tend to do with outside advisors, we don't, in the indirect tax team, we don't outsource a great deal of compliance work. And I suppose traditionally that compliance work is the more routine kind of activity that you'd expect advisors may be more likely to compete on in terms of price.
Mm.
A lot of what we're doing with advisors, I think, is more high value work. And so it's probably a lot less about competing on price. But as I say, there will be instances where we think, do we actually need external advice on that issue? Or because we have a big, well-resourced team of experienced people, are we happy to just do it internally?
Yeah, so sometimes then there is actually a decision between doing it internally and externally then. I mean, like, will that change based on the circumstances? Because if everyone's flat out because there's loads of returns due, you just kind of have to go external, or is it literally? Well, I suppose it's like with everything. There's going to be a lot of factors that feed into it. Well, really, more than anything, and no one size fits all answer with these.
Yes, I would say certainly in the last year or two, those decisions about putting a piece of work out externally haven't been so much resource driven. They've been more driven by considerations about expertise or whether we can do the piece of work at all. As I said, there are factors around, especially if it's a foreign jurisdiction and we're not familiar with the language, or if it's a high value dispute, or those kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that someone said to me before, it might have even been you at some point, but like unless you actually work for the business like you do, like it's almost impossible to know the business really well to understand like what a good decision is from a tax perspective for them. So like how much does that impact your decision when you use an external advisor, I suppose? If they really understand your business well, is that a really good thing for you? And if they don't, is it a categoric no, we won't use you type thing?
If they know the business really well, they're definitely going up the priority list. And if they know the business really well, they probably know the people in it quite well. So that there's a relationship advantage they already have there. But if an advisor knows the business well, or say they just know the industry well, then there's just a sense that they're going to hit the ground running a lot more quickly. And I've had a lot of this experience in where I work now, where we tend to find that in the UK and some of the other larger, more established jurisdictions, such as in Europe, advisors are a lot more familiar with the industry itself. So they're more familiar with what betting and gaming is and what the kind of products are. If you go to a more emerging market, then it doesn't matter what advisor you speak to, there's less familiarity. And the reason I mention this is because it's allowed me to see just how much more challenging it is to brief an advisor and to get practical advice from an advisor if they don't have the familiarity at the start.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, in the past, I've tried to obtain, I've obtained advice from advisors in parts of Africa and South America, and a lot more time and energy has to be invested by me and my team up front to educate the advisor on what we're actually doing to enable them to then provide the advice. And so there will always be a preference, I think, for those advisors who know the industry, know the business. But at the same time, it's not a deal. Sometimes it can't be a deal breaker if there are very few advisors who understand things. And, sometimes we have very niche products and services where there isn't likely to be anyone that immediately is familiar. Or we might be launching something new and innovative where realistically no advisor is going to have seen it before.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things you mentioned earlier as well is actually about having, or you mentioned it a few times actually, about receiving practical advice. So from your side, being on in-house, I think it was, you said this to me before, but like sometimes like if there's like, I don't know, £1,000 worth of tax at stake, like you're not going to go to town on a piece of research, right? It's such a small amount of money compared to it. And so I know that from a practical standpoint, you just take like a reasonable view, right, on something like that. And is that what you mean by practical when you're talking about external advisors, or does it stretch further than that, do you think?
It goes further. So you're absolutely right. The amount of tax at stake is a factor in whether or not we even need to talk to an external advisor, or if we are talking to an external advisor on how much work we want them to undertake, it has to all be proportionate. So for £1,000, I'm not going to go and spend £500 on a piece of advice. It would be a bit. But when I say practical, what I'm also thinking about is advice that's readily usable. And what I've seen sometimes with some advisors, to give you an example of where it's not practical, is, and I don't think you as a self-respecting tax professional would recommend this approach, Jack, but an advisor almost just copying and pasting bits of legislation without any analysis or application to the taxpayer. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but I'm going to come back to my point about comparing the advice you get in some countries to others. And this applies for all different types of firms, I'm afraid. There are some jurisdictions where it seems to be more acceptable for advisors to simply say, well, I found the relevant piece of law.
Yeah.
I've put it into a memo.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And the reality is we all know that language barriers aside, we can all do that on Google most of the time. It might be challenging in some countries because you've got to use Google Translate and you've got to find out where they actually keep the legislation. And maybe there are bits of guidance or practical information about the view of the tax authorities that isn't published on the internet. But I certainly don't want to be paying an advisor just to give me a list of rules. I'd like them to tell me how it applies. And also, if there is ambiguity, and we both know sadly there often is,
Yeah.
I'd like the advisor to stick their neck on the line a little bit and have an opinion.
Yeah.
And actually give some advice. Which way should we go? And that it's not always necessarily just someone taking a guess at what the best approach is. I'd like the advisor to bring to bear some personal experience from other situations, or maybe from interactions with the authorities, to be able to say, on balance, the better approach might be this or that. Or, there's actually some parallel in some other industry or some other area of tax that we can use to tell you that this is more likely to be the right answer than something else, even if the law and guidance isn't clear.
Yeah. No, I have had a piece of advice over the last 2 weeks that was ambiguous, and it was frustrating because the clients of mine, they had a product that kind of rested solely on the technical answer to this. And it wasn't black and white, but I kind of did what you said, which is I stuck my neck out and said what my view is and why. But I also made them aware of the alternative. And I made it very clear where the ambiguity lied. So when they're thinking about it, making a decision, and when they're talking to their clients to sell this product to, that they could point out exactly where it is and why. I mean, my overall piece of advice was to change the setup to remove the ambiguity, but they didn't really want to do that because I'd already had a bunch of clients potentially in the pipeline and stuff. So I had to try and work with what I've got. So I did give both kind of interpretations and why, said what I think is the right answer and why, but still made them aware of the risk. But it doesn't feel satisfactory as an advisor doing that, but I didn't feel like I could get them to any better position. Unfortunately, it was like the best of what I could do, I felt anyway, in that situation.
Was the client happy, can I ask, Jack?
Well, funnily enough, actually on the Teams call, I was talking them through it. They actually commented on how much they liked the commerciality, I suppose, on it. So they were actually really happy, and they're going to give us more work. So, that's usually a good sign, isn't it? But I could have had another person who wasn't, for whatever reason, happy with it because it's ambiguous. But yeah, in that case, yes, they were happy.
No, that makes sense. It sounds like, you say the law was ambiguous perhaps, but the advice was
The advice wasn't,
not.
yeah. The advice itself wasn't. And it would have been nice if it wasn't ambiguous because I could have given them a yes or no answer, couldn't I? But, you have to work with the law, don't you, unfortunately, in these things. So we spoke a lot anyway about, I suppose, what good looks like then. On the point of practical tax advice, this is not just something that in-house tax teams value. It's something that all clients value, and it is something that I suggest you learn how to do well as early as possible in your tax career. And one thing, what you consider to be practical right now might not actually be considered practical by clients. If you do want to make sure that you can provide excellent practical tax advice that clients will love you for, that will result in them being happy to refer you on to others, and that will leave them coming back for more, then I suggest you take a look at my tax advice masterclass. The next one is being delivered in November 2024, and the one after that will not be delivered for at least another 6 months after that. For full details of the tax advice masterclass, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP105. And even if you're just a little bit curious or interested, please do go and take a look. And I know it's going to be obvious in a lot of cases that bad is the opposite of the good, but specifically, like, what does bad look like then? I suppose in particular, if you had any experiences of bad there, you can draw upon here.
Well, I'll tell you something that I'm afraid annoys me about some advisors, which is people pretending to know things or exaggerating their credentials.
Yeah.
And I have come across that. And I'm afraid those people get found out. And that is definitely an example of bad. I've had people before tell me that they have certain experience or they've worked with certain people or they know certain things. And I mean, the problem is that I like to think I know quite a few people and I can check some of these things,
Yeah.
or I might already even know whether or not it's correct. And so I don't think any advisor should ever think they're going to get away with exaggerating or pretending in terms of credentials and experience.
Yeah.
That's a real bugbear for me because if you do that, the trust is just
Of
gone
course.
straight away. But
Yeah.
it does happen. And I suppose the other thing that obviously is particularly bad is just the sense if an advisor is unreliable or disorganized in some way.
Okay.
And of course, it's human nature. It happens. But part of what you want from an advisor is the practical, useful, technical advice. But you also need to be able to rely on them to meet deadlines, to talk openly,
Yeah.
and you need to know that if you're briefing them, they're taking it on board, they're making notes, and they can take into account what they've said to you before, and those kind of things. Those are the particularly bad qualities I've occasionally come across, which I strongly counsel against.
Yeah. But where do you stand on being told like something that you don't want to hear, even though you kind of would you rather someone dress it up or just tell it you as it is, being on the receiving side of the advice?
That's a good question. I think, look, I want to know what the honest answer is. So if I've asked a question and the answer is, oh my goodness, you have a £100 million tax liability,
Yeah.
you're going to prison. Hopefully not, but I would like to know that. And it's important to know that. But I think it comes down to communication style, where what I would say is if an advisor is going to deliver some bad news or some challenging news, that has to be done through a conversation. So that is not the kind of thing that you get a request for some advice and a couple of weeks later you send back an email saying, yeah, you got it all wrong, you're in serious trouble.
Yeah.
No one wants that to happen that way. And the reason is, if it is bad news, well, one, it's easier to break it, I think, on a phone call or in person, just because that's human nature. But also, if you're delivering bad news, you need to be sure it's actually as bad as you think it is. And then you also need to think about, what does it mean for the client or the specific person in the client, the tax professional, let's say, who's receiving that news? How is it going to fit into their world? What I mean by that is, if someone does, I send an email and 2 weeks later I get one back from the advisor saying, you've got a £100 million liability that you didn't know about. And by the way, the directors are facing criminal prosecution, etc., etc. What am I then supposed to do? I've obviously got to deliver that internally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I'm going to deliver that internally, I need to be absolutely sure that we've completely convinced the bad advice. It's not the bad advice. The bad news is as bad as we think it is, that we've explored all options, that we have looked at ways to mitigate, that we have an action plan to solve it. I don't just want to be dropped in a position of, I've got this terrible news. Now I've got to break it internally and I don't know what to do about it. Oh, and by the way, if it's really, really bad, maybe I'm in trouble as well. And so I don't want an advisor to put me in that position. So I think I want the honest truth, but it has to be delivered in the right way. And it might well be that once I have the conversation with the advisor, the advice ends up being refined, or there is some more nuance that can be put around what the consequences will be.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yes, there's this £100 million liability. However, based on recent experience, we think the authorities are only going to seek £1 million, and you can do a deal. And as long as you disclose it next week, you're going to limit the penalties and interest, whatever it might be, that kind of thing.
So you want them to do as much as possible, really, to help you with the bad news, to help you fix it. And you want to be reassured that they have thought about every scenario and everything possible to make it as less bad as possible, basically.
Yes, yeah. And that they know what position it's going to put me in as the individual receiving the advice. Because, hey, it might be that, hopefully not, but maybe I've done something or missed something. I'm an in-house tax professional, and as a professional, I want to get things right. But also, if I've done something wrong, I'm going to have to answer to people internally.
Of course. Yeah.
And so a lot of sympathy and empathy is required in those kind of situations between the advisor and the client, I think.
Yeah. You really need them to help you personally as well as the business, I suppose, to deliver the news. Yeah. And deal with it. Yeah. No, it makes sense. I should probably ask this question earlier, to be fair, but it sounds, in the way that you're giving a lot of your answers, it sounds like you do a lot of the corresponding and interacting with the advisors. But are there other people in your team that deal with that as well? And does it really depend on what it is that is being done with the external advisor?
Yes, there's a few of us that work with external advisors, but you're right, it depends on what the advice is. Obviously, I'm the most senior person in the indirect tax team. I do have some experienced senior managers, and I have some more junior members of staff as well. And I think most team members are interacting with advisors at some point, but in different ways, as you suggest. So we do have some work with advisors in relation to compliance, despite what I said earlier about us not tending to outsource returns in my team. There are some countries where we have to have a local agent, you have to have a fiscal representative, and there will be some routine, often monthly engagement with advisors on that. Now, I have no interest in being involved in that, and there are other team members who are responsible for those returns and making sure they're filed and paid, who will engage with the advisors. There are some long-running claims and disputes, sadly, in some parts of the world in our business. And in those cases, those are certainly not straightforward or routine pieces of work. There are often, there's courts involved. There is a long history. There are live disputes with authorities. But I will have other team members who are looking after those on a day-to-day basis. And that's because they have the history and the expertise on those issues. They have a better relationship with those advisors than I do. Where I'll tend to get involved is certainly if we're commissioning a new piece of advice, I always want to be involved. And that is not me, hopefully, being a control freak or a micromanager. But on the one hand, I need to understand what we're doing from a budget perspective.
Yeah.
So what I can't have is other team members randomly commissioning advice, and then the first I know is I get a bill for £10,000.
Yeah.
And worry about what's happened to our budget. And it's also just to make sure that I think we are going to get the best out of the advisor. So I just want to have a sense check. So sometimes that will be me commissioning directly from an advisor, but other team members do as well. So
yeah,
it's not all me.
No, fair enough. I've got a question actually that I didn't have down here, but it's kind of related to how you select external advisors. So let's just say hypothetically that you've got someone that has never done any work for you before, the entire firm and the individual that wants to. Like, how can they best try and build a relationship with you and then get a piece of work type thing? Because, the generic sales messages, LinkedIn or email, I'm guessing just go straight in the delete box, right? So, like, how realistically can someone go about doing that? Do you think that is good for you as the as the person they're going to ultimately provide advice to?
Mm-hmm. Well, you'd be surprised how little cold calling, if that's the right term, I get from advisors. Not that I'm not asking for that or inviting that, but I don't get a great deal of targeted messages on LinkedIn or email or phone calls from advisors, and from advisors that I don't already work with. And that might be because people don't know we're there, or they think we're already on top of things because of the team that we have. But I'm not quite sure. I would almost expect to have a little bit more of that kind of activity. And we just don't get so much of it. I think in terms of someone building a relationship for the first time, well, ideally, they've already got some kind of established credibility. And I think you mentioned LinkedIn, and I think that seems these days to be a really good way to do this. It's incredible how much tax content people are sharing on LinkedIn. And I make a conscious effort to find people who I think are writing interesting, useful, relevant, up-to-date things and follow them. even if I don't know them, I'm not connected with them, the great thing is you follow them instead. Or you pick, sometimes you'll come across those people because other people in your network have liked them or reposted something they've said. So I think step one is have some credibility before you're even trying to establish the relationship through either existing clients or just writing thoughtful, useful things and updates. And as we know in the world of tax, it's not hard to have things to write about that are new. Yeah. It's changing all the time. And then I think the second stage is just to try to then have a conversation. And I know this is where we get into the idea of cold calling, but I think I'm not averse to being contacted on LinkedIn or email, or dare I say even the phone, by someone I haven't worked with before, if they've got something genuinely interesting and valuable to say. I think where people just delete all the LinkedIn messages and emails is where they are clearly generic or incorrectly targeted. The one I get a little bit tired of, if I'm honest, having said I don't get any of this kind of thing. Yeah. The one I do get quite a lot of is lots of messages about technology solutions. And I don't know, I think a lot of them are just not well targeted, because I think if you work in indirect tax, you get a lot of those kind of messages because you can't handle indirect taxes without having the right approach to software and data because of the nature of the tax. And in the UK, over the last few years, there's been a big drive for businesses to implement the HMRC Making Tax Digital requirements, which has driven a lot more activity in terms of implementing new VAT return preparation tools and that kind of thing. I do tend to get still quite a lot of messages from people saying, have you taken care of MTD? We've got some great software for you. Are you happy with your current MTD software? Yeah. Why don't you change to us? And I'm not such a fan of those messages just because, changing my MTD software, it's not something we're going to do at the drop of a hat. No. Having been through a big implementation process a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think also some of those messages could probably be a bit more effective in terms of thinking about, well, what's the scale of this business? Yeah. What are the challenges we have? We are in the UK, we're a part of the exempt business. We have a partial exemption special method. Yeah. From a VAT perspective, we're more complex than most. And so trying to offer a more generic, simplistic Making Tax Digital piece of software is not going to go down too well.
Yeah. I think if you imagine for a second and that someone reached out and they had made an attempt to understand the issues that you might have, and maybe even some of them are right and some of them are wrong, and then try to have a call, would you be more likely, do you think, to, go back to them and maybe even chat to them at some point, as long as you thought, obviously, that the overall product or service was going to be something of value to you?
100%, because I think then someone has shown willing, they've made the effort, and I think it's then worth having a conversation with them, even if it doesn't lead anywhere. So, absolutely.
Yeah. So then just one last bit to add on to that question and overall, then when you do need advice, then how do you choose who to go to? Because it sounds like in pretty much the UK and other jurisdictions, you've got a few people that you can choose from that you already know of. So do you always choose someone that you already know of? If there is someone in that jurisdiction that you do know of, would you always go with someone that you know, or would you sometimes reach out a bit more widely than that, say?
The starting point is probably someone that I know or we know. So if I don't know someone, we've got a big team, so someone else might know someone. And that's certainly the starting point. Beyond that, look, if we're going to a jurisdiction where we're really unfamiliar, then I will start to ask around. And so again, it comes down, so this, we're now moving from knowing someone to knowing someone who knows someone. Yeah. And I will use my personal network to see if there are any recommendations. And usually between those first two options, knowing someone or knowing someone who knows someone, you find a solution, you find a contact. Going beyond that doesn't happen too often. It can. So, very occasionally I will just see if I can find a name online. Mm. Not the best way to do things. And I still think a lot of professional services firms aren't very good at making that information available about who works there and what their area of expertise is in such a way that you can find them. I mean, a method I haven't tried, but which has just come to mind now, is maybe I should be looking a bit more on LinkedIn. Or maybe I will find more things in the future from Google, from people's LinkedIn profiles, because that is a great opportunity for advisors to put themselves out there and to list their skills and experience so that they can be found by clients.
Yeah, I think you're more easy to find a person that knows how to do something rather than a firm, because ultimately it's going to be the person in the firm that knows how to do it anyway, right? So yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
What I don't think I've ever done is try and find a generic inbox of a firm somewhere and send a message saying, "Can you help me?" I'm sure it's theoretically possible.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't happen very often, I don't think. I've seen it a few times, but yeah, people tend to find a person or the right team maybe to send an email to. So, bearing all this in mind anyway then, because, you have been on both sides, what do you think you would do differently then now if you were back, I don't know, for a Big Four or whoever it is that's advising in-house tax teams? What would you do differently?
Well, I'm going to stick with my theme of LinkedIn. I would definitely post a lot more things on LinkedIn. I think it is an underappreciated way for advisors to make their presence known, to demonstrate their expertise and what they're up to. And, things, I mean, it's 7+ years since I was in practice, and I think LinkedIn is more popular than ever. And I'm not on commission, by the way. I know I keep saying LinkedIn. I think I would make a lot more effort to check in with clients and potential clients than I used to. And I mean, again, it might be because I'm older, more experienced, wiser than I was when I was in practice, and a bit more senior in my career. Maybe I've got more confidence to do that now, but I would certainly spend more time checking in with people, regardless of whether I had necessarily a specific issue to deal with. As long as I knew the person and thought we could have a sensible conversation, not to waste their time, but just to check how things were going.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I would naturally be a lot more empathetic to the plight of in-house tax professionals than I was when I was in practice. And that's just what happens after the experience I've had. I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about, would I like to just be given the bad news by an advisor?
Yeah.
And I would, but I'd communicate in a certain way. And so I think the way I'd communicate with clients would be a bit different. I'd be a little bit more alert to, or I'd hope I'd be a little bit more alert to what was going on in their world and what different pressures they might be facing and what other things might be going on. So, one thing that has wound me up sometimes with advisors since I've moved in-house is, from a UK perspective, we know that most businesses prepare and file VAT returns in the same week or two every quarter.
Yeah.
That's just how most taxpayers do on a standard calendar quarter. And they have a bit of a flurry of activity every 3 months to prepare and file VAT returns in the UK. But you wouldn't believe the number of advisors who will try and schedule some kind of seminar or conference or event during that period.
Yeah.
And that's not great in terms of empathizing with clients if you're doing that. And obviously, you're not going to please everyone when you're scheduling the date for an event. But things like that, I think I would like to believe I'd take more into consideration if I was on the other side of the fence once again.
Yeah, I suppose now you just know more about the things that do annoy you and other in-house people than what you would have done when you weren't there, because you would have probably done some of the things that have annoyed you to other people at some point, I'm guessing.
I'm sure that's got to be the case. Yeah. Got to be the case.
So I know we've talked about an awful lot then here anyway, but I suppose just to briefly summarize then now, like, how can an external advisor then be the advisor that an in-house tax team wants to work with and would value?
Yeah, I think it's about, effective communication between the advisor and the client, empathizing with the client and what they're dealing with, having a genuine interest in and a concern for the client, what's going on in their world, having an idea of what their priorities might be, and being able to bring something new to the table and to bring value. We talked about the size and experience of my team, which I think does influence what kind of advice we'll seek externally. But we do still use advisors, as we talked about. So there is clearly scope for advisors to help businesses and in-house teams of all shapes and sizes. Just a question of working out how, where, and when.
Yeah, no, agreed. So where can people learn more about you anyway, Stephen, or even potentially get in contact with you? You said you're not being paid by LinkedIn, but I'm sure that's going to crop up as probably the first one, first place to go.
Absolutely. Definitely LinkedIn. I have an open profile on there, and I'm happy to receive messages, and occasionally I do. And if it makes sense and it's not someone trying to sell me some MTD software, then I will certainly respond and be happy to connect with people.
Thanks to Stephen for the super valuable advice that he gave us in this episode. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP105. And in there you can find a link to the previous episode with Stephen, which is episode 53, which is all about Stephen's move from Big Four to in-house. You'll also be able to see a link in the show notes to the full details of my next tax advice masterclass, along with a link that you can use to enroll onto the masterclass. If you enjoy this episode, you can sign up for email notifications to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes. Head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays, for all periods where the podcast isn't on a break, that is. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.